we have to have an increase in the ongoing defense budget. We are at a time in which we ever get into a serious conflict, we will have a conflict in more than one theater. We are not prepared for that today.
Is the United States ready for a two-theater war? Senator Mike Rounds, a senior member of the Armed Services Committee, says no. Let's get some more context on this. Joining us now is Matthew Shoemaker, a former intelligence officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency. So, Matt, do you agree with the senator's assessment?
Short answer, kind of. Built into his question are a whole lot of assumptions that he's making. One of the assumptions that he kind of alludes to is if we get into one war, we're therefore going to get into a couple or a few wars. That's an assumption. There is no guarantee that that's going to happen, right? But he is 100% right with regards to his comments about how we need more artillery production. We need more production with regards to hard hit, if you will, with regards to military equipment and materiel. He's not wrong about that at all. A lot of our stuff is a lot older than what our adversaries, such as China in particular, is making. So we certainly need an influx in production capability with regards to that. And another element to it as well is, is the solution really just throw more money at the problem? I am of the opinion that that's not the solution, and that what DoD really needs to do, they really need to go into their books. They need some sort of independent organization, whether it's DOGE, whether it's someone else, someone other than military and military contracting people who are going to benefit from this system, to look at those numbers and look at the budget and say, are these elements that we currently have, is that actually necessary, or can we save that money and put it into a more useful place elsewhere, rather than just throw more money at the problem?
So you just said throwing more money at the problem may not be the answer. Let's put that into perspective. In 2024, the federal government spent $1.6 trillion on discretionary budget items. So that's pretty much everything other than Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Of that $1.6 trillion, they spent $842 billion on defense programs and $750 billion on literally everything else. So how do we still have a readiness issue when we spend all that money on the military?
I ask myself that question every single day, up until about last year, when they alleviated this problem that I'm about to articulate a bit. Up until last year, the estimation coming out of DoD itself was that roughly 20 to 25% of all military personnel were either food insecure or at risk of being food insecure. So that begs the question, what in the world are we spending our money on? And that's why I come to the conclusion that throwing more money at a problem is not the solution. It's how we're spending that money. And the Pentagon has a big problem because it's, the fox guarding the hen house in terms of who these people are that make decisions about where the money goes to, what requirements are for the money. A lot of these 3-4-star generals and admirals, as soon as they get out of the military, they go and they work for defense contractors. On the one hand, they've got a lot of institutionalized knowledge. They know exactly, in theory, what is needed and who to talk to about that. So from the more positive and positive assumption side of things, there is a value in that. But on the negative side of it is that's a great place for corruption as well. So, there's a lot of issues that DoD needs to tackle when it comes to monetary issues. And providing for a world-class military is expensive. So let's be clear, to be the best, you got to spend to be the best. So it's going to be expensive, but we got to make sure that we're getting the best bang for our buck. And I do not think that that's the case at this point in time.
You and the senator also mentioned modernization. As an example, Houthi rebels were using drones, which cost an estimated $2,000 to attack commercial vessels in the Red Sea. The Navy was shooting those drones down with missiles that cost $2 million apiece. And then in addition, Houthi rebels in Yemen have used missiles estimated to be in the 5-figure range to shoot down 6 MQ-9 Reaper drones that cost $30 million apiece. Should the U.S. be using these advanced expensive technologies to take out rudimentary weapons?
That really is it's a philosophy question more than anything in terms of what we want the philosophy of our military to be. Um, do we want to make the decision to go towards a high number system that might cost very little? So, for example, we get a bunch, we buy a ton of very small drones, and let's say they're kamikaze type drones or so, that might cost like $1 million or so per system, and then just flood the area with it. That would be that is a type of philosophy question that we have to ask about what we want our military to be. That certainly would, in theory at least, protect a lot of lives, especially with regards to our pilots and such. And it would be a good bang for the buck. Whether or not we have the political will to achieve that, I don't think it's there at the moment. It's not part of the political discussion with regards to the military. It is kind of on the below the surface element to it, but there's always a lot of money flowing through these things. And when a system like the F-35 can cost upwards of 150 million dollars per item, there are a lot of very high profile individuals and high profile companies that want to make sure that they get their voices heard to make sure that they can produce those sorts of things. So, it really comes down to political will. I hope we can eventually get there. The fact that we're even having this discussion about that, I think, is helpful. So hopefully one day we can get there. I don't think we're there just yet.
Now, let me go back to where we started. What makes a country prepared for a two-theater war?
Yeah. So within that question is going to have to be a whole lot of assumptions made about what that theater war looks like, who it's going to be, what time of year it might start, what the objectives of that two theater war might be, and what the capabilities of that, those hypothetical countries are in order to tackle that. So you got to make a whole lot of planning assumptions. So just for the sake of argument, if we wanted to take, for example, like a Russia-China-US war, there's, that's going to be very different from, let's say, a North Korea-Iran style, two theater war. So with regards to that, China, you're going to focus, at least in the initial stages, on their capabilities and their focus, which is going to be anti-access area denial of the South and East China Sea, for example, most likely. In which case that's going to be very heavily Navy oriented and to a certain extent Air Force, versus a European theater style war, which is what we planned for the better part of the Cold War, which was very heavy with regards to the Army.
Pick it up, move forward, bound.
So those are how you tackle each of those is a great exercise in military planning. Let's put it that way. But within that as well, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine plays a really good example in terms of the role and the value of planning and whether it be an invasion or just a military operation itself. Because if you remember, in February 2022, the Russians attempted to open up a three-pronged attack into Ukraine. It was going to go from the east, the north, down into Kyiv, and then to a certain extent from the southeast. They were trying to do a three pincer approach type thing. Having every element that you add to it, every direction that you're trying to attack from, that requires an extensive amount of planning, an extensive amount of logistics and logistical planning to make sure that your warfighters have the equipment they need and the replenishments that they need when they need it in a quickly and timely way. And obviously, since we're still talking about this 3 years later and the Russians haven't achieved their objectives, they clearly either did not plan accordingly, or they didn't take into account that the enemy always has a say in the process as well. So they weren't able to pivot when necessary. So all of that is a great learning experience, at the very least, for the Americans, of whatever a two theater war is going to look like. You got to plan like crazy in order to do it, and you got to make assumptions in order to plan it. And then on top of it, you need the political will and the political side of things to actually give you the equipment and the material that you need in order to provide options if that two-pronged approach is ever necessary. So there's a lot of issues in there that's certainly one reason why having a world-class military is so expensive, because you now have to plan for all of these things, especially now that the adversaries themselves are getting better and spending more money on their own military. So there's a whole lot of factors involved in all of this.
You just mentioned a conflict with China would be reliant on the Navy and Air Force. So the Navy's trying to expand its warship fleet from 295 today to 390 by 2054. And the Air Force is trying to replace the F-22 Raptor with a next-generation fighter in the 2030s. But in both those cases, you see it's going to take years or decades, and adversaries aren't going to wait for us to be ready. Like, China's not going to say, oh, we better wait to move in on Taiwan until the United States has its new 390 warships. So what do we do in the meantime?
Yeah, so just for a little bit of clarity on that too, built into your the question a little bit is the assumption that it's only the U.S. and only China, in which case that is a big problem, right? In the sense of China has very specific goals that they want to achieve, in theory, with regards to their military and with regards to their navy, i.e., anti-access area denial of the East and South China Seas. So that's very limited in scope in what they do. The United States has global commitments, of course, in which case the United States is very hard-pressed, let's say, to focus all of its resources just on the East and South China Seas, whereas China has a much easier time of doing that. In which case, and one reason why we've seen over the past number of years the United States reach out to countries such as Japan, Philippines, Australia, is an attempt to augment the American capabilities. So in the event that the United States and China ever do go into a shooting conflict, that the United States can draw on resources and allies in the area that, number one, know the area a lot better. They have their own resources relatively close to theater itself, and in which case the United States can now augment its own capabilities and act as a force multiplier, rather than just have the United States, which has, at most 350 ships or so, versus the Chinese, which have upwards of, I think in terms of their actual naval capabilities, somewhere 400 or 500 now. I'd have to check the exact number, since it's changing every day, but the Chinese are all focusing in that, very limited area. So the United States is focusing, at least in theory, on augmenting and being a force multiplier with its allies. So the United States doesn't necessarily need to be, in terms of beam counting, par for par with the Chinese Navy if we focus instead on force multiplication with our allies.
And final question, you've mentioned multiple times that you have to assume certain scenarios when planning, which means to me that the military has to be ready for anything. So you think about times in history like Lend-Lease during World War II, where the United States was not prepared and pretty much needed every able body to meet the moment. Do you think the United States is prepared to do that if necessary?
So military planning itself is, I think, one of the critical elements of any modern military. I myself was not a military planner, despite the amount of time that I've spent discussing it on this interview. I have a great deal of respect for the military planners, though. And one thing that I did learn from them along the way was that you're never going to be able to make the perfect plan, because, as I also mentioned, the enemy always has a say in these things, and it's impossible to plan for every single contingency. Having said that, though, what the United States is able to do, especially by having these plans in place, even if they're imperfect plans, is having the institutionalized knowledge of how to think quickly on your feet, how to plan quickly when things do go sideways so you can correct for it. And in terms of whether or not the United States can ramp up production, to fight a two-front war, that unfortunately, and you use Lend-Lease as an example, which I think is a great example. If I remember my history correctly, the United States really only jumped into things and ramped up its military production once, stuff hit the fan, and once the United States got involved. So I think from the way that the American political system is and how it has been historically, going back, however many decades or centuries that you want to go, until there's a problem, very rarely do we invest the way that we probably should. But once there's a problem, we have, at least up until this point, always risen to the challenge. So I think we certainly can solve any problem that we're associated with based off of the historical example of us doing so. It's not guaranteed, of course, but hopefully we'll get one day where we're able to plan accordingly so that we don't get to the situation where we have to catch up once problems actually arise. So we'll see. That's really what it comes down to, unfortunately.
Matthew Shoemaker, former intelligence officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it. I'm Ray Bogan for Straight Arrow News. For more reporting, download the SAN app.